Hi, this is Gary Jordan again, and today we're going to talk about natural law as it relates to society. Since natural law doesn't function by itself. I mean, it does and it doesn't. Well, as human beings, we live in groups of varying sizes. And so this natural law has functions within the society. And it shows us how to interact. That's where the tire meets the road, as the old saying goes. Um, and I personally think that natural law societies, and I'm going to use that to cover uh, ancient ones, societies that use natural law, modern ones, and postmodern societies, as opposed to societies that run on written legalism. So I believe that natural law societies are the expression of our healthiest state as interactions. And there are some conditions that seem to apply to all of them and some that don't. One of these things is that it is very, very helpful to our survival. I believe that had our ancient ancestors facing the last ice age or the end of the last ice age, they would not have managed to do anything at all had they had our corporate legalism or English common law legalism, in which an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, so much resources and time is spent on squabbling and stealing from others. I don't think our BC would have made it. So I think it's in survival. It is a just in the best interest of the survival of our species to return to that natural law society setups. So what do they have in common? So what do these natural law societies seem to all have in common? So for one, they have no centralized government. The Native American societies that lived under natural law, they were a tribal people. They lived in small groups of under several hundred per village at the most. And they were cellular in structure, so you could come and go. If you didn't fit in or you became a problem to that group and you were out of harmony, you moved off and started your own tribe, your own band. So it was very decentralized. There was no king. At most, you had a shaman who was the spiritual healer who had a deeper than most people, other people's connection to the spirit world. And you had a council of elders. Um, they had chiefs, but they were mostly um, specialists. These were the masters, the grand masters of their particular trade. Your hunting chiefs, your fishing chiefs, even in the women's societies, they had the equivalent thereof. I don't know if we would use the same term, but they did have the elders. Many of them, in fact, were matriarchal, and so the elders were, in fact, the women, not the men. But that's a whole different story. The other thing is that these tribal societies that lived under natural law were very adaptive, extremely adaptive. They were not in any way rigid hard like ours are, where you have to follow some ancient precedent from thousands of years into the past. Two examples that show just how flexible and adaptable the Native Americans, for example, were of North America are the horses, which first came back to, because of the colonialism, returned to this continent after being gone for 10, 12,000 years, about 400 years ago. By the time by the American expansion had gotten into the Great Plains from the eastern seaboard, they were using the horse routinely. We now know that the horse was only about 100 years um, or so on the Great Plains before the white man first came and saw them. All And it was integrated into their society, into their religious thinking, into what made prosperity in such a way it looked like it'd been around for thousands of years, but it hadn't. In fact, many of the Great Plain tribe were actually from the eastern woodland, the far western portion around the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. They were forced out because of the colonialism. So they were so adaptive that they merged with the Great Plains lifestyle of the buffalo hunt and all the other aspects of it, as though they were there for forever. It looked like they were there for forever. The other example is the teepee. The teepee was being developed and improved even as the um, settlers and explorers came into the Great Plains. And in fact, in the late 19th century, when the Great Plains had the buffalo, which was the original material for the coverings, had been wiped out. They were using cloth. They were trading for cloth, for army duck cloth from the settlers. So the Great Plains, toward the end of the century, 19th century, early 20th century, before the teepee became a museum piece, was actually being modernized, and even the material was being changed and made to adapt to the condition. So tribal cultures, natural law cultures, and societies are very adaptable, just like nature is. Yet it looks timeless, just like nature does. Another characteristic, as I say, there's no government, centralized government. There are no, they're very adaptable. And I think those are the two characteristics we need to look at. And they were very informal. They were very informal and very, like I say, very timeless, very now oriented. And so as we transition back to a natural law society, we're going to be spending less and less time worried about, well, how did they do it in the past? The codes of Hammurabi, or however you pronounce his name, Hammurabi, the Sumerian king that gave the first written laws. There are no authority figures. We don't look up to some king from a faraway land to determine what is appropriate. So those are the characteristics of a natural law society. And the modern there, spelled X-E-E-R for those that want to look it up, is from a place from Somalia. When the UN colonial government and the extension in the UN collapsed in '95, everybody expected that the Somali would turn into a badland, a barren wasteland, yet prosperity is actually returning to the land of Somalia under their natural law culture. The other thing that is imperative, or that is a major characteristic of natural law society, is the emphasis on cooperation and teamwork as opposed to competition. And in fact, modern biology is showing that is the way of nature. There is something called symbiosis, where two or more life forms literally live together and share the life force, if you will. And one gets to a point where one cannot survive without the other, and the other cannot survive without each other. I mean, that's just what symbiosis is. Um, so there's a lot of cooperation in nature, far more than there is competition. And even the hunter-gatherer, even the hunter-prey relationship, which was used by Darwinists and neo-Darwinists to show competition, is really not even competition in the sense that we've been taking it. So that's a misrepresentation of nature. And it's not well suited for survival. But cooperation is. And again, as you look at these hunter-gathering societies and horticultural societies before the grain agriculture and centralized governments come into being, every last one of them has a high emphasis on cooperation. That's why in natural law you see restitution, restoration, the healing and the of the breach between two parties, if at all possible, or such healing that as can be done that will permit the community to live well and be survived. If that means you have to exile individuals because they are being too disruptive to that community, to your community, then that's what you do. But you don't do it in hate or to be vengeful. You do it with the spirit of healing. And maybe they'll go off and they'll find their own community where they really do fit in better. And it's a free will choice association. Every person being an individual sovereign. They had individual, and Native American names are not like ours. We're taught to think that they were groupthink, but they're not. They're very individual, very autonomous individually, with each person being a sovereign, but that sovereignty is an inter-sovereignty. It is it's hard to describe because we don't have it in our society. So that's kind of the goal we're aiming for. And so some of the videos that I'll do later will deal with different issues, different topics that will address how we go from where we are here to where we would like to be there, which is a natural law society, instead of one based strictly on authority figures, strictly on precedent, which is some written document like the Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights. As fine as those documents may or may not be, you don't base a decision on them. You might look to them and think, well, this was something that was done. It's an historical fact, and that's part of natural law, looking at history. What did you do or not do? So that is what some of the videos will eventually be about. What are the characteristics of a natural law society? How do we transition from that? What can we look at? What of our own institutions might we need to let go of and release? And what institution might we need to borrow from other cultures who are still using natural law in our postmodern world, such as the Somalians there? So this is something to think about, and I figured this would be a good time as any to show this is the goal of what Natural Law for America is about. How do we transition from a corporatized, bureaucratic, controlled society, which we are very inflexible, to one that is flexible, timeless, and that is able to handle all the varying changes that we will likely see in the coming future, so that the next several generations of boys and girls and men and women who will come along after I'm gone will have a world that is filled with abundance, filled with beauty, filled with art, crafts, and all the things that we humans have done for thousands of years. Oh, that brings me to one other thing I want to mention before I go, and that is when you're looking at the internet, you're looking at history, and you're looking at, well, society gave us all these things. No, actually, civilization, I should say, they didn't. All the foundational skills and arts were developed thousands of years before grain agriculture, thousands of years before centralized government, thousands of years before money, which only came into being 6,000 years ago after centralized government came into existence. And same with written law 6,000 years ago. Land ownership didn't come until 6,000 years. But think about all the stuff that we use. The sweater, even though it's made by a machine now, was the knitting that goes into making a sweater was developed 28,000 years ago. They found basketry, the weaving that would be the same for knitting as it is for making a basket or making rope or nets for fishing 28,000 years ago. Pottery, they knew that same site that I read about a few years ago. That same archaeological site, they had clay that was must have been thrown into the fire, and they knew how to make it heat and explode, probably for special effects. But they knew about it. Hunting, fishing, pottery, all done. The potter's wheel, boats, riding on boats, navigating the ocean. The Polynesians were apparently island hopping some over 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. Long before money, long before all the stuff that we're told that we need to have for creativity. So I believe that when we get away from a moneyed economy, we go back towards natural law and what all that implies and doesn't imply. We're going to have an abundance and a creativity of the likes of which we haven't seen in perhaps 6, 7, 8,000 years, depending on what part of the world we're from. So anyway, that concludes today's topic, which is to introduce where we're aiming for, what the natural law for America is striving for. What is the goal of this YouTube channel? So I hope you have a good day and a beautiful day, and may you find the beauty in all of life. Thank you. Bye-bye.